I'm not sort of trying to encourage Nottingham to endorse the, and Helen put that there, to encourage Nottingham to endorse the Charter for Compassion. And part of this dialogue about how this actually happened is what's kind of informed this roundtable. Because a lot of the obstacles that we bounce up against is this whole translation around everything compassion and then how things are measured and monitored in terms of community development and policy making at the LSP level, PCTs and so on. So that's the kind of the foundation. Now I'm really happy with the people we have on the stage here who are going to talk about it. It's a very diverse mix of perspectives. And I'll introduce people more fully as they present themselves. And so we have Vanessa from Action for Happiness, and she'll be doing the presentation first. Daniel Rand, you may have already met. He did a short presentation yesterday from the Thames and Getsu Institute. Ari Cohen is actually a little bit of a hero of mine, not that he knows that. Does work around the Compassion Action Network. And Jules Evans, who's coming more from a philosophical background around this whole area. So we'll go straight to it. The idea is to do 4 quick-ish 12-minute presentations, and then we'll just try and open it up and just try and have some of this conversation around policy and compassion and empathy. So if we start with you, Vanessa, if that's okay?
So I'm Vanessa from Action for Happiness, which some of you may have heard introduced yesterday by Richard Layard. Now, Richard is the founder of Action for Happiness. It started because in 2005 he wrote a book called Happiness, Lessons from a New Science. This is pretty radical for a world-renowned economist to start talking about and arguing the case for things like soft and fluffy in things like economic policy and healthcare policy. And the driver for Richard is that we've been, in the last sort of 50, 60 years, depending on which data set you look at, we've been getting richer than we, exponentially over time. And we're richer really in terms of, certainly in the Western world, the things that we have than probably at any point in history. Yet if we look at measures of happiness and psychological well-being, we're actually at best no different. It fluctuates slightly. It doesn't fluctuate very much. And worse, mental ill health is increasing. And it affects probably 1 in 4 of us over our life course, and it's happening at an earlier and earlier age. And the earlier it happens, the more likely it's going to be pervasive throughout life. So that's sort of Richard's sort of backdrop and wondering why is that and what can we do. And I was thinking about this as a sort of economics meets psychology, because at the same time as starting to think about this, psychology has been moving in a different way and starting to look at what is it that we can do as individuals and what is it about our psychological makeup and how we develop as individuals that can make a difference to make life more worth living. So less about dysfunction, why that happens and how to cure that, but more about how can we think about how to get more out of life. And so I think this Action for Happiness really is the intersection of those 2 things. So we have 3 beliefs here. And I think this is where the compassion piece fits in with our agenda. It's fundamentally, if we look at a lot of the science of things that make us happier, the number 1 thing for our well-being is other people and our connections and relationships with other people. Chris Peterson, who's one of the founding fathers of positive psychology, who sadly died a couple of weeks ago, had a great mantra: simply, other people matter. We want to be happy. And this is, for me, is where compassion, as we've heard, comes in. Because in a way, that's the social glue. We're social creatures. And compassion is something that, as we heard from Paul Gilbert yesterday, that helps our societies work and evolve. And we know from neuroscience that actually helping other people is not just good for them, it's actually good for other people, for ourselves as well. And it creates a sort of virtuous spiral. And I think this network diagram there, for those of you who are familiar with the work of Christakis and Fowler, I think this is quite an interesting, throws up some quite interesting questions for me, in that our psychological well-being is impacted not just by things that we do and our relationships with people immediately around us, but by 3 degrees of separation. So how I'm feeling today will be impacted not just by all the lovely people I've met this morning, but the people they met and the people that those people met. And this is quite interesting, because this stuff spreads. And when it's not there, that spreads too. And I think it places a responsibility on us as individuals to actually be very conscious of the impact we're having in the world and those around us, because that affects other people. And therefore, I think we need, Action for Happiness has a sort of two-pronged approach, really. A sort of top-down policy. Let's think about what policy does and how policy affects what policy implications of this stuff are, but also from the bottom up. And we also need to think from the governance perspective from the middle out, from our institutions, our schools, our workplaces, our healthcare systems, and how we're managing those and how that affects how people are. So I think thinking about some of those things really from from the top-down approach, what gets measured gets done is an old adage that it goes around, and that to some extent is true. If we're only looking at measures of GDP, we're only going to think about economic growth, and that perhaps is the cause of the psychological well-being problems that we're encountering. And I think if we've got a framework for thinking about well-being and we're thinking about happiness, in which compassion is a part, then that helps us make, as governments, both at a national level and a local level, makes better choices. Bhutan, who is the first nation to start measuring well-being and looking at this at a national level, they have a framework for policy making based on their 9 domains of well-being. They've got 33 indicators, and each sort of each proposal around a policy change or a new project or investment is evaluated against each of those. So does it add to, what's the cost? Of course, we have the cost pieces there, but what's the impact on the well-being of our nation? Is it positive? Is it negative? Or don't we know? And they use that as a framework for evaluating the choices. And I think that helps us make quite different choices about what we do. Because what bang are we getting from our bank in terms of this? So is it something that implements what helps well-being, or are we just making decisions on an economic level? And if we think about policies in each of these specific areas, we know in an educational context that social and emotional factors explain a higher percentage of academic performance than IQ. We know that that's particularly pertinent for children from more deprived backgrounds, that if they have well-developed social and emotional skills, that improves their life chances. So how are we embedding that in our where we're investing in education and our curricula? In the thinking about work is a fundamental part of life for adults. And unemployment is highly detrimental. So how do we make policy that actually takes that into account? So to really minimise unemployment, which perhaps means a focus on economic stability rather than economic growth, and how do we get people back into work? And if you think about the governance of our workplaces, how are we managing that? How are we leading our institutions? As Richard said yesterday, are we creating workplaces that are highly internally competitive? And given that our workplaces are a very important part of our social infrastructure, and we know that matters, or are we trying to create institutions where collaboration and working together is a much better place? And that has organisations that pay attention to some of this stuff generally perform better than those that don't over time. And I think there's a very interesting question, and there's not much out there about that. What are we doing to inform and educate shareholders around the importance of this stuff? Because those are the people, those are the ultimate sort of masters of in our workplaces, in our organisations, and how we begin them to think about that. And in healthcare as well, how are we thinking about some of this stuff? So I think what thinking about a well-being dimension to thinking about healthcare creates quite a different emphasis. I mean, firstly, it says that actually we need to pay attention to psychological well-being, and maybe more, how do we invest in that for people? We know that depression's rising, we know that scripts for antidepressants are rising, but actually we also know that talking therapies and other things that can actually make a difference. So how do we help our patients improve perhaps their skills about dealing with other people, as Paul Gilbert was talking about yesterday? If we can treat them, we start to prevent. We're not just treating their condition in the moment, we're actually giving them skills which help to manage it over the life course. So can we take a more preventative approach now and build those skills? And I think this is something, as the model that Felicity Hubbard at Cambridge has suggested, that if we're focusing on building the skills and educating our communities more widely around the things that make a difference for their well-being, and things like the relationships with other people, we start to see a shift in the spread of mental ill health throughout our populations. So her work is suggesting that if we focus on improving the skills of a lot of people at the average of the population, that shifts the curve here. So this is a much greater focus on prevention in our our healthcare. So, and I think that this also comes back to informing one of the roles I think of Action of Happiness is actually unpacking what happiness means for individuals. Richard talked about our 10 keys to happy living as a sort of accessible framework, but it's all based on evidence about what makes us happy. And if we think about that as individuals, that makes us make life choices. It helps us also then lobby other people, our institutions, for taking these things more seriously. And in the Harvard 10 keys, they're over there. They start off with, the first one is giving, is caring about other people. And the next one is relations. And the last one is meaning, and these things are connected. That if we can inform people about these things and help educate them, that helps helps us to create a sort of more happier and a more compassionate society.
Just one point, Vanessa. There was a piece of research released by Facebook not so long back that actually showed that we're 3 degrees away from half the planet.
Yeah.
So if I join the two together, then theoretically how happy we are is influencing potentially half the, or certainly how we represent our happiness on Facebook could potentially be influencing half the planet. That would be an interesting way of looking at a kind of wider impact and our own kind of well-being on the benefits of others, huh?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's very interesting because it does, for me, we're not passive, in this. We have to play, we have to be active in this because we do, it can have an impact and it starts to create attention on this.
Okay, so this time I'm just going to move the mic round for you, David, actually. But, so this is David Rand, another kind of hero of mine, not he knows that either. So he met His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1979 and subsequently is now the executive director of the Tenzin Gyatso Institute, which is another name for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he's kind of my kind of leader, so he's very innovative. He does a value-based program or pioneered something in the Aspen Institute, as well as kind of linking in with more profit-making services and so on, but obviously with an ethical basis and so on. So I'm incredibly delighted to meet David. I haven't met him before, so I'm really interested in what he's got to say. If I just move the mic down, please.
Maybe to say just something about the Tenzin Gyatso Institute first. A disclaimer, if you will. We're a non-political, non-advocacy institution. In fact, as in the United States, we're registered as an educational charity. So we abstain from taking political points of view, or from, as I say, from advocating for particular positions. But I think we can say a few things about this topic in lieu of His Holiness. And forgive me for trying to do that. I don't feel qualified, actually, to speak on behalf of him. But I do think that his public teachings and his vision, as he's articulated, even on his website, is instructive for this conversation. You may know that His Holiness has been talking to scientists and to educators and leaders for over 30 years. And people often wonder why he was doing that, especially within the Tibetan Buddhist world. They often said, why were you talking to scientists? And as time has gone on, 30 years down the road, we see more of the fruition of that dialogue. It's clear that I think probably we'll all come to some of the same points of view as probably you have as well, that there are certain themes, if you will, that can highlight policy and governance that can actually determine outcomes. And how those get measured and what kind of interventions can be done, or those are kind of for maybe still debate. But I think it's pretty clear, and I think the fact that you're all here today, we're probably somewhere further down the road than we think, amongst having a critical mass of people who believe that generosity, that empathy, that a spirit of community, of altruism, are actually themes or guiding principles that we could use to create policy and to influence governance. So there's lots to say about this. I mean, I just came, as an American, I was in the States during the election. And maybe you followed it, and if you didn't, you're probably better off for having avoided it. But that conversation, really, the debate between the two parties was about, in some respects, a major part of that dialogue was about givers and takers, between moochers and producers, between those who create wealth and those who consume it. And this schism between these two factions is actually, I'm glad it was explicit during the election, because that's actually, I think, a kind of a human dilemma. That's something we all have to struggle with at times, between us and them. And again, to quote my American counterpart here in lineage, we have the Statue of Liberty during my city, in New York City, called the Statue of Liberty. And on its face, it says, we welcome the huddled, tired masses yearning to be free, which was put there, 250 years ago. And for me, it indicates a sense of community. It's indicative of a global family, of the fact that we're all in this together. And I think our policies are not reflective of that. And the fact that, we don't need to kind of go through a litany of the ills that our society faces, but it's clear that that sense of community, that sense of connectedness, is something that His Holiness feels very much about. He will say often that, it's in fact, there's a recent talk he gave in Canada, and he talked about the fact that on one level, he's Asian, on another level, he's Tibetan, on another level, he's a monk, but really at the bottom, when you get past these differences, he's a human being, just like we all are. And I think that if we can kind of find a way to insert that into the conversation and to open that up for people, that can drive policy, actually. Because if we're in it together, if we realize that our fate is connected, then a host of ills can be addressed. Environmental degradation, economic injustice, violence, the kind of the ills that we all know exist. So I think that we start from the basis of what His Holiness says, which is that we're in this together. That your happiness, my happiness can't be done at the expense of yours. That these models, to move into maybe a bit of an economic domain, and something I have a little bit of experience about in the past, is that there's this whole model, economic model, I think Vanessa pointed to it as well, of consumption, of acquisition, of the winners are measured by their achievement in that with that stuff, right? The more I have, I'm more of a winner. The less you have, you're more of a loser. And I think that this model of consumption, of even how we measure GDP, is it's based on that. Economists freak if our GDP begins to shrink. And I think that is indicative of a worldview that we can see the results of now. So I think that having this sense of community and having this sense of connection is first and foremost. So what kind of policies do we have now that actually reflect those values? We do have some. And again, in my country, I know in the UK and in the Eurozone, and elsewhere, there are policies that do kind of just do that in the real world. Unemployment, insurance, a safety net for those less fortunate. These are things that we cannot do without. I mean, there's actually an emerging school of Buddhist economics. You may be familiar with E.F. Schumacher here in the UK. 40, 50 years ago, he wrote "Small is Beautiful," and it's that kind of those kind of ideas that I think we can build on and grow a new paradigm. Because clearly, what's required is a new paradigm. I mean, one of the things that we're engaged in at the Tenzin Gyatso Institute is we're bringing Tibetan Buddhist monastic scholars to American universities. Right now, we're just doing America, but and why? Well, His Holiness feels that this conversation between modernity, between the tremendous advancements that we've made in technology and comfort, and having the time to think about these things. I mean, this is a relatively new moment in human history that we actually have the leisure to discuss these ideas, right? So we bring these monastic scholars who represent this wisdom culture of compassion. There were so many speakers yesterday who referred to His Holiness, and that was not kind of scripted, right? So it's clear that we don't have enough of those kind of individuals in the world, at least in my view. And so this conversation between modernity and this wisdom of culture, or this wisdom tradition, actually, His Holiness believes can lead to a new paradigm. Can you imagine that if modernity, if scientific progress, if technology were married with the inner values, the science of compassion, what kind of conversation we may be having as human beings with each other. So that's one of the things that we're engaged in. And on one level, it's about education. And another level is about preserving the Tibetan culture. But I think it's also, in a deeper way, reflective of this conversation I began talking about, which is what His Holiness did 30 years ago, after the diaspora of 1959, where he came to the West and began really learning about the rest of the world, because this culture was developed almost in total isolation from the rest of humanity, and at the expense of material progress, frankly, for centuries. Why? Because they focused on the inner values. And so I would suggest that we can talk about policy, we can talk about governance, but I think that it actually begins with us. It begins with me. We need to transform ourselves. And I think somebody mentioned it yesterday, and again, it's on YouTube, you can see His Holiness, but he talks about this impact of having one individual impacting 1,000, those 1,000 impacting 10,000, and so on. And we need to transform our own kind of emotional, or negative emotions, our own destructive emotions, if you will. And by that I mean, of course, anger and greed and jealousy and the kinds of things that get us into trouble. That it has to begin with us. Otherwise, it becomes a completely intellectual exercise, a completely theoretical undertaking. And I don't know about you, but when I engage in those kinds of exercises, I spin off very quickly. It needs to be grounded somewhere in my body, for me. And I would propose that the more we can, each of us, experience that sense of empathy and compassion, of connectedness, and as Paul Ekman closed yesterday's conference by talking about, choose what works for us. And meditation is certainly one way, but we start with that. And out of that can become maybe some new ideas, some new paradigms. If I have just a couple more minutes, I will leave you with a quote from a great reverend. I call him Reverend. How many people have heard of the group The Band? Yeah, The Band. If you haven't, please check them out. The drummer, his name is Levon Helm. He passed this year. Levon Helm had a great quote. He said, "Take what you need and leave the rest." Thank you.
Thank you, David. So if we move straight on to Harry, who won in 2011 the National Peacemaker of the Year Award, and he's writing a book called The Compassionate Organisation, Awakening the Organisational Heart. It's out next year, isn't it? And he's a recipient of the American PSR National Public Health Award for his work to end violence, and I know he's done some incredible work in prison work and so on. So I'm very excited.
Thank you. I work as a theorist, and for those of you who don't know what that means in America, it means unemployable. My son keeps saying, "When are you going to get a real job, Pop?" And I said I didn't want to really drop that low and do that. And I work with human relationships and thinking about those kinds of things. I am alive because of acts of compassion, coming from a very difficult environment, so I have a very tender sense of this. And so I'm going to give you a wee bit about my perspective, and you don't need to have the same one. But my perspective is that these things like employers and governments and customers and so on are fictions that we have used to organize ourselves in order to do something, to move forward. And sometimes we actually think we are those things when we're really the sons and daughters of humanity. And that we're in the midst of what appears to me very clearly as a metamorphosis, that we've kind of worked out the end of what's really been going on, like in economics, for the last 500-600 years. And now there is this great change. And so what is the role of compassion in all of this? And I love the statement that Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, said, that compassion is the basis of all morality. And I believe that to be absolutely true. And so I worked, one of the theoretical, I didn't really prepare anything this morning because I didn't think it was fair for me to know what I was going to say before you did. So I'm hoping this is good, or I'm not attending another one of these. So anyway, so I'll do my best. But I was the one who worked and developed the International Campaign for Compassionate Cities, which now has 75 candidates and I think 8 confirmed cities, one of which is Louisville, Kentucky. Now, it looks like it's pronounced Louisville. You can die in Louisville for saying Louisville. And I had to practice for 2 weeks coming from Seattle to go back down there where they have this thing, just like the United Kingdom has this very exotic thing to me called history. We don't have that. If a home is built in Seattle before 1950, it's a National Historic Landmark. Louisville is such a great example of compassion in action in a civic environment. And the mayor, Greg Fisher, made compassion the basis of his administration. It's the first time he's had elected office in his life. And he has promoted this, and he does it personally as a living example. I've coined a phrase for myself to understand, a thing called compassion bypass. That is where you create the illusion that you're being compassionate when you actually don't have to get your hands dirty. And that is, somebody in Seattle says, well, compassion is we're going to videotape our friends explaining on the video what compassion means to them. And I said, that's great, but that's not compassion, nor is it compassion in action. And I was on the TED State of the Charter. I was up at Simon Fraser University and with Karen Armstrong. I think everybody's seen her yesterday, the quintessential English eccentric woman. Yes, and we got talking about compassion has a very different meaning in English, but compassionate action isn't necessarily defined. And we define it as taking personal responsibility for alleviating and preventing the suffering of others. That means you get your hands dirty, and it is not an easy business to do. Well, Mayor Fisher really has decided to make that his life, really, in administration. And there was a story of a girl, this is just typical, because not just for the young lady that this involved, but because of the example it gave to the people of Louisville and outside the city. Young lady in school had gotten a award, and she'd overcome SAD, social anxiety disorder. Came from a very difficult background, but she was asked to give an acceptance speech. It's the greatest thing you can do for somebody with SAD is to stick them in front of a microphone in front of a bunch of people. And she got going, and she started to choke up and began to get terrified. And Mayor Fisher came up and put his arm around her shoulder and said, do you need a little bit of help? And she said, yes. And he says, well, okay, let's keep going. She'd start to read her speech, and then she would start to falter, and then he would pick up the words while she got it back, and then she took over, and they both did this interchange together. And the model of that is classic public health. It's making people aware of what the possibilities are, triage, deciding where we hurt, applying a protocol to it, which in this case involves our hearts, evaluating it and going back through the cycle again. And so they had a Give a Day program there where they asked you to give one day out of this week to compassion. And they had 150,000 hours of helping kids learn to read and painting churches and all this kind of thing. And then they have painted their coaches, the transit system, with these compassion things from kids and so on. And then in Mayor Fisher's policies about the police department and so on, our police department in Seattle is under investigation from the feds and is under a restraining order because they've taken to shooting people a wee bit too much. I mean, we can tolerate a certain amount of being blown away with Glock 40s, but one must use discretion when the number of people that you're killing, and they've gone too far. And so in Louisville, they're working on this in their Metro United Way program, their charity, and then Tori Merton McClure, who I adore, who's 6 feet and insists on punching me every time she gets excited. So you'll notice that I list to one side, about 15 degrees. She's about 6 feet tall, first woman to ski to the geographic South Pole, and the only American to ski to the South Pole. First woman to row across the Atlantic Ocean on her own. And so she says, I'm slightly competitive. No, really, Tori. And her university, she got very competitive, which is Spalding University in Louisville, became the first certified compassionate university. And I think that's we're doing a summit conference on compassionate organizations and the Dalai Lamas. It's during the period of Dalai Lamas in Louisville in May. You're all invited. And we're going to do it at Spalding. Well, she then put it into action in civics teaching. To get a nursing degree or a teaching degree, you have to go through compassion training. And then the city sends employees to a program that goes several weeks to train them in that, on what it is and how it works and what the benefits are and what the neuroscience and all that sort of thing is. So it's quite good. And they won they received the International Compassionate City of the Year and the 2012 most livable large city in the United States from the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And it's really quite remarkable, their example. They're not waiting for our federal government or the state government to do anything. They're just going to go ahead. And it's seeping into other institutions such as the legal field and so on. And there's some discussion about, well, you know, what about government, whatever. I say, infect everything with it. When I was at dinner last night with Karen, I said, don't worry about the charter. It's out of the box. You can't put it back in. It's loose. It's being unleashed on an unsuspecting world, and they can't put it back. The jig's up. We're going to go do this. And so that was it. And then the policies within the, oh yeah, I mentioned transit police, social services, courts, and other areas. Now I gave, and people like Muhammad Ali now were supporting the cities and everything, so it's great, a boxer. So I'll say one more thing. I don't know how much time I'm going to. Oh my gosh. I'd like to talk a little bit about my life. I don't want to kill the audience. Oh my God, now I forget what I was going to say. When I came across through the UK border area, you know, my passport, you know, Americans are so popular throughout the world. They just see us coming and they go, oh my God, thank God, these humble and dedicated and very sweet, non-aggressive people. I used to be involved with airplanes. When I was a boy, I became very angry and I found a way to kill people in mass legally, and that's to fly in with my helmet on and my oxygen mask. But I didn't do that, by the way. So you're all right. I ended up doing that. But as I came across the border, the lady says, I gave her my passport, and she said, how long are you staying? And I said, until Sunday, if that's all right. And she said, and why are you here? And I said, I'm at a conference. And she said, what kind of conference? And I said, it's the Empathy and Compassion Society. And she dropped my passport and leaned down at her little desk. She says, they have that? And I said, yeah, and not only that, they have it in the United Kingdom. And she says, what's it? You know, and we had a talk, and the lines backing up. And she said, well, that's what we need that here. You know, like the border control or whatever. And I said, darling, they need it everywhere. They need it everywhere, including us. So that's the environment we're running into. It is infectious compassion. It works in government. It can be applied. We use a public health approach to measure it. We talk about measures and so forth. And we are the sons and daughters of humanity. When we wake up and find out that we can do any bloody thing we want to make our world any way we want, that we are not held by these fetters of sorrow and suffering, that we can create a world that's safe for people and has shelter and nourishment and so on. We just have to roll up our sleeves and let go of this great, albeit interesting hallucination that we're in, and create ourselves another one. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mary, for that entertaining talk. And it's definitely something in terms of when I speak a lot around compassionate societies and cities and so on. The kind of conversation inevitably seems to turn to some sort of paradigm shift or a change of understanding of what's possible. And there's a wonderful piece of research that actually only 10% of the population, if they actually believe in something completely, actually the other 90% follow. So it's actually a very small number in terms of this tipping point for some mass-scale population and paradigm shift. So
I just wanted to say one other thing, that Darren's one of my heroes.
I'm embarrassed now. So this is Jules Evans. He's Policy Director for the Centre of History of Emotions at Queen Mary University of London, and author of Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations, which I very much like the title of. So, and also the co-organiser of the London Philosophy Group, and blogs at www.philosophyforlife.org. So,
thank you. Good morning, everybody. I write about philosophy and well-being, and I don't write that much about empathy and compassion as of yet. So I would say I'm a bit of a beginner in this area. So I think I can learn a lot from you, from people here at this conference. I'm standing in for my friend Jonathan Rowson from the RSA, who runs the Social Brain Foundation. He's ill. So I'm going to keep it brief and then learn from you in the questions and answers. But it's definitely something that I've come to think about more, and think about the place of compassion and empathy in philosophy. I wanted to talk a bit initially about the idea of how to build caring communities with regards to kind of practical philosophy. So how I got into this area was when I was at university. I had SAD, as we've already heard, social anxiety disorder, and depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I had that all the way through university. And at that time I had a very loving girlfriend who tried to love me back to health through compassion. And sadly it didn't work, because it was just like trying to fill a pot with a hole in it. I didn't love myself, so no matter how much she loved me, she couldn't convince me that I was a worthwhile and valuable human being. What helped me instead was, when I was about 22, I came across cognitive behavioral therapy, did a brief course in that, and through that explored Greek philosophy, which may surprise you to know is where CBT came from. It was inspired by Stoic philosophy. And that's, then spent my 20s really exploring Greek philosophy and meeting people who used it in their lives to help themselves. The idea in Stoicism, and to some extent in cognitive behavioral therapy, Martha Nussbaum, the great philosopher of the emotions, has described Stoicism as an anti-pity philosophy. It says that if you're emotionally suffering, a lot of the time you're doing that to yourself. You're beating yourself up. And no one can stop you doing that except yourself. If you've got yourself in a hole, you have to get out of it. So in that sense, it's an anti-pity tradition. You've got to help yourself. So that helped me a lot in my early 20s. This philosophy, this quite resilient, kind of gritty philosophy of tough love. Like you're suffering, well, stop beating yourself up. Help yourself. No one can save you but you. And that kind of put me back on my feet. But after, during my later 20s, I started to think that perhaps this is quite a libertarian, overly gritty philosophy. Did it make too much demands of just pull yourself up and be a man, kind of, quite kind of macho philosophy? I started to be interested in more in like community. Can we help each other? Stoics was a philosophy that grew out of the collapse of Greek city-states. So it's like, how can you live a good life when institutions all around you are failing and there's no community? So it's really an individual philosophy of the good life. I thought, well, what about now? We don't live in 3rd century BC Greece where societies are collapsing. How can we build good communities? So I looked around for other Stoics in the mid-20s and found lots of them through the internet. And there was actually a Stoic community these days. And I organised a gathering of the Stoics in 2010 on Marcus Aurelius' birthday. The first gathering for 2,000 years. It didn't go very well. And it wasn't an unmitigated success, because you bring together all these individualist Stoics, and they all argued with each other. We had our first schism of our new kind of, before the conference started. Some Stoics said every Stoic has to believe in God. Others said no, they were extreme atheists. So there was a huge fallout before the conference, and then another fallout at the conference. And by the end, it was pretty much just me left. That struck me that it wasn't the most communitarian philosophy. So I looked around other types of philosophy, community, and I discovered things like philosophy clubs, like the London Philosophy Club, which I went. I thought, oh, amazing philosophy club. I went along and talked and got involved in organising it. And we now have like 2,500 members, and I started to research these kind of philosophy groups and philosophy communities all over the world. And just today, actually, I'm launching this website called the Philosophy Hub, where people can find their local philosophy group. And I'm publishing this enormous report I've written about these kind of things. And places like the School of Life, Alain de Botton and Roman and other people's kind of great philosophy school, things like Action for Happiness, some of these kind of philosophical communities we're trying to build now, which in some ways are kind of substitutes or alternatives for religious communities. And what I'm wondering now, at the moment, is to what extent those kind of communities can be really caring, compassionate, and nurturing communities, those kind of communities of reason, as it were. In those kind of communities, can we genuinely care for each other? can we genuinely get to a point where we can treat difficult, problematic strangers as if they were members of our family? That, it seems to me, the challenge. And I feel like that, looking at where philosophy clubs are at the moment, or these kind of organisations, there's a big difference. There's a bit of a gap there compared to some kind of religious organisations. I look, some of the people I really admire are, for example, Tobias Jones. I don't know if any of you have read his book, Utopian Dreams. He goes around and looks at various communities to try and find places which really care for each other. He decides that really at the end, he needs some kind of religious basis to really, or at least he thinks the communities that really care for broken human beings are often religious communities. And he set up a commune like that for really broken people in Somerset. Or like Danny Kruger is a person I really admire. He was the speechwriter for David Cameron, and he wrote that famous speech, Hug a Hoodie. But then decided that the best way to really kind of create a compassionate society was not through public policy, but was through grassroots community work. So he left politics and he set up a charity called Only Connect, where he works with inmates who ex-convicts who recently left prison. And he lives with them, with his wife. They live in a house together, genuinely sharing their life and their space, and then put on kind of theatre productions together. And to me, that's an incredible commitment to your fellow human being. Or like take Jane Addams's Hull House, the way that she lived with the people she was working with. It was a proper community, really kind of sleeves rolled up, giving your time, giving your life to that. And so I think when I look at organisations like the London Philosophy Club, for example, I think, my God, we're a long way from that. I mean, we organise nice talks, we have, people come together, we create some kind of community, but, my God, we're not living with, each other, or really giving our lives to kind of, and recognising how broken humans can be, really. At the same time, though, the rational, autonomous liberal in me is suspicious of kind of do-gooders and suspicious of priestcraft. I come from a Quaker family, and I'm wary of gurus. When I was a teenager, I was deeply impressed by kind of Buddhism, like a lot of my generation, and by these kind of great gurus who'd come over to the West and seemed to have all the answers, and we just assumed that they really were reincarnated beings that were pretty much incarnations of God. And then we all learned that a lot of them had very much clay feet, and they were feeding up their female students, or they were alcoholics, or these kind of things. So I'm wary of switching that, flipping that switch in your head where you just give, way to complete reverence for holy, compassionate figures, because often I'm also aware that we're flawed creatures, so we shouldn't switch off our skepticism as well. So a few more quick points. Empathy and altruism might not be enough on its own. I read a great book last year, Daniel Batson, who's a great psychologist who's looked at altruism and empathy, and he's really proven in experimental conditions what he calls the empathy-altruism hypothesis, which is that humans do good because we have the ability to take the perspective of other people and then act out of a concern for their welfare. But he says that there are various different motives that might prompt us to do good things, to do pro-social things, not just empathy-altruism. There's egoism. We might do good because we recognise that helping other people is in our interest as well. There's collectivism, doing good because we feel that someone's part of our community, part of our tribe. And there's principalism, doing good because we think it fulfills a certain moral law that we recognise. And you look at sometimes when people do very pro-social or altruistic things, it might be for a mixture of motives. You take all the volunteering we saw in the Olympics, this great kind of optimistic surge of people giving up their free time. Well, that was probably both a sense of altruism, but also collectivism. It was a sense that we, Britain, are putting on this thing and we wanted to work. Batson suggests that, in terms of public policy, he writes, strategies that combine appeals to either altruism or collectivism with appeals to principle might work. So not just appealing to people's sense of empathy, but also, justice, it's the right thing to do. Also, these are part of our, the collective of Britain, say, or of humanity. And also, I would say, working with empathy and with evidence, just kind of generating a nice warm feeling isn't sufficient. Find what works and find hard evidence to show that your strategy is successful, and that will persuade people who might be sceptical. I've just been reading a book about C-Bomb Rowntree, the great kind of Quaker social worker. I come from a Quaker family, and I've only recently started exploring this kind of Quaker tradition, so it's great to be here in this building. And anyway, C-Bomb Rowntree wrote this book on poverty in 1902, and he went around the slums of York, his native York, showing the conditions in which poor people, the working classes, lived there. And that aroused a lot of empathy and shock, really, among people, just shining a light on those conditions. They had no idea people lived so poorly. But it wasn't just an appeal to emotions, that book. He also, in a very scientific way, showed the minimum nutrition that a human being needed to do a day's work. And that most people, a lot of the working class around Britain, were paid less than was capable of giving them the minimum nutrition to do their jobs. They were suffering from malnutrition. And he just painstakingly, he was a great kind of sociologist, he had a social research team, painstakingly built the evidence to make his case. And used it to argue for the minimum wage and to help to build the welfare state in this country. So, be inspired by empathy and compassion, but also work out what works, build your evidence case. I notice in therapy, a lot of people will come into therapy with a heart overflowing with desire to help other people, but not necessarily an awareness of what works. It's not enough to go into therapy with a deep desire to kind of touch and help other people. You need to also look at the evidence of what actually does help people. Look at what works. Thirdly, just 3 more points. How much more time? I'm out of time now. I think we can look at public policies to help people to work together, to get them to meet each other. Public policies that encourage things like joining clubs, those kind of civic connections that encourage social capital. When Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone in the 90s, he was worried that we're really running out of social capital. I think in the last decade there's been a renewal, a revival of social capital. It's now, through the internet, much easier to join kind of clubs and organisations and so on. But I think we could do a lot more. I like the idea of something like the National Volunteering Service, which some people have suggested, getting young people to go off together and join in groups with people from different backgrounds. One of the reasons that I think we've become less compassionate is because we have less spaces to join with people from different backgrounds. The reason people supported the welfare state after World War II was they'd fought with people from very different backgrounds. The reason the Conservative Party's changed was the generation of someone like Harold Macmillan had fought with working class people. Today, modern Conservative politicians, someone like David Cameron probably doesn't know many working class people that well. So, creating spaces where people of different backgrounds work together. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jules. There's a couple of things that popped into my mind. The first one was Eddie Izzard, actually. He did a presentation on BBC News not so long back about volunteering, and they were asking how did he get them to volunteer and be funny and stuff like that. He said, well, I didn't actually do anything. I just told them to go up and just say things. And actually people then just spontaneously, off without comments, encouraged people, and this wonderful atmosphere around the London Olympics just arose, because people were just expressing what perhaps is generally kind of bottled up. And the other one was this, in combination with all the other speakers as well, was the Thupten Jinpa, His Holiness has translated, did a presentation at Seacare, and he kind of characterised compassion having 3 components, cognitive, an affective, and a motivational. And so the cognitive is like, I understand you, and affective is, I feel with you, and the motivation is, I want to help you. So there's very much this movement towards relieving suffering of others and kind of being engaged. And it feels very much like that's the direction that things are going. It's like an engaged form of compassion about relieving suffering and cultivating the conditions for happiness itself, and transforming ourselves and then the society through that means. So thank you very much. So I just wanted to open out for if people had questions or comments about, in particular in relation to governance and policy and so on. There's a roaming mic, so please just put your hand in.
Hi there. Thanks for your comments. I just have a question. I don't know who can approach it, maybe several of you. I do a lot of work with corporates. And just picking up on your last point, Jules, the question about diversity and inclusivity in corporates. And I hear, particularly from women, because I work on some women's issues, I hear a lot of women who lead initiatives in corporations talking about, the measures that they've put into place. Is this okay? Yeah. The measures they've put into place, or the activities, the programs, the initiatives, the mentoring, the advocacy they've put into place to ensure that their organizations become more diverse and inclusive seem to be well received, but actually they're not having success. So they're seeing still decisions being made where diverse, culturally diverse or racially diverse or there are only two genders, but let's call it gender diversity is not happening as a result. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or experience on how compassion and empathy and being more compassionate and empathetic, whether in policy or otherwise, might help in some of those goals and aspirations.
Well, I can talk a little bit about some of the work we're experimenting with in organisations recently. And one of the, I think, I'm not an expert in the sort of diversity policies in organisations, but I come from an organisational background. I think those are good in teaching about awareness of those things and building skills, but they also highlight difference, which is something that I have a slight problem with, because I think what a lot of these messages are is that there are certain fundamentals about being a human being. Other people matter, our relationships with other people matter. How we bring out the best in people. And I think we have to get back to fundamentals. Now, I'm somebody who's made a living in the past from designing HR programs and policies and programs and competency frameworks and corporate values and all that stuff. It's all well-meaning and it's good, but it doesn't cut to the chase. So I think we're now I'm hoping we're now in a new way where we are cutting to the chase in organisations. We've just piloted a program with managers, which is actually about teaching them some of these basic principles about what is it that really fosters psychological well-being. Jesse and Ryan's work, the 3 basic needs for psychological well-being are relatedness, our connections with other people, autonomy, a sense of control. So I feel like I have some say in things, and mastery, that I am being able to use my capabilities and grow my capabilities. If we just take those 3 principles and teach them to people in organisations, that can make a shift. And you can almost find that in any situation. And we train managers, and it's made a shift in how they're dealing with their staff. They've also applied to their home as well, so there's a benefit outside there. So I don't know. I think my thing is, I think we need to cut to the chase about what are the things that make a difference for us as human beings, and put that in the centre of our
highlighting
organisations.
sameness as opposed to highlighting difference.
Yeah,
well.
exactly.
I think the Quaker idea of people talking to each other can be really good. So, like, Siobhan Rowntree worked at Rowntree's Chocolate Company, and they were pioneers of the idea of employee welfare. And they did things like suggestion boxes, getting feedback from people, and they pioneered work councils. So getting managers to talk to employees, creating spaces where people can talk, spaces of conversation. Roman Krasnarek here has done things of just creating conversations between, like, say, CEOs and homeless people, or different bits of a company, different bits of an organisation to get it talking. So, like Barclays, the new CEO of Barclays has sent all his top managers on a crash course in Quaker values, to get them to talk to each other more. So, I think there's things in our own culture that we can learn from. I'm just beginning to learn about that kind of Quaker ethos, but I think it's a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, my name is Roman Krasnarek from the School of Life. Thanks for the mention, Jules. A few years ago, I wrote a report for Oxfam about how to teach empathy in schools. It was called You Are, Therefore I Am, How Empathy Education Can Create Social Change. And the aim of that report was to try and lobby the British government, which was at the time trying to changing the primary school curriculum, and there was this big sort of consultation process. And lo and behold, it was amazing. The draft report for the new primary school curriculum included all this stuff from the report I wrote about why empathy should be at the centre of the school curriculum. It could almost be a subject like geography and history, and we were all very, very excited. But then with the new incoming government, that draft curriculum was just torn into pieces, and it was replaced by a basic reading, writing, arithmetic kind of curriculum, and empathy and compassion was just basically cut out of it. They didn't build on the social emotional learning stuff which was already in there. And I felt, what am I supposed to do now? I felt like sort of giving up lobbying government and thinking, okay, I'll just try and do empathy education work in alternative schools. So my question to you is, what should I do now? How do you convince an intransigent government to take on board these ideas which they think are fluffy and ridiculous and do nothing for economic growth, all the stuff you were talking about? How do you actually make them listen?
You don't. Forget about it. You don't. There's an illusion that governments lead. They don't. They follow. So what we have to do is take the leadership. I mean, when we had the civil rights law in 1965 in the United States, Rosa Parks had ridden on the bus about 12 years before. So what you have to do is realize that they're at risk of being organized irrelevancies, other than the fact that they can tax you and do some other things. And you go ahead and take the leadership, and what happens is then, when it becomes normative, it goes. But in my experience, trying to change governments, rather frustrating experience. What we do with our Compassionate Cities campaign, we establish the campaign in the city and let the government watch. And then I was asking Houston, they said, well, what are the benefits of us becoming a Compassionate City? Well, you tell visitors that this is a good place to come. Houston, Texas is a good place to come. It's a wee bit of an oxymoron, but okay. But you have this benefit and you get civic participation. And they said, oh, okay, well, that sounds good. And I said, now here's the other side of it. What happens if you don't? Does Houston, Texas want to be the last city on the planet to support compassion? And my God, I've never seen panic so quickly. I said, you can be. You've got this reputation of innovation and stuff. Perhaps we should drop that. And you could be known as the ones that showed up last. They're going to probably pass it in May. Now, and so what we do is we change it. We make our normative thing. I mean, to have the Beatles get the OBE. I mean, rock and rollers. Well, the public came out. So, you know, that's what I think we have to do. And in the continuing thing of educating them about what's normative. Because you have to ask what is it they want. They want to get elected. They want to hold their jobs. And so on. So how do you do that? How do you do that?
Building on that, I think that's fantastic that, you know, governments follow, they don't lead. And I think starting at the ground and actually showing evidence that this stuff works. And it's, you know, there is a movement, there is broader evidence out there. I mean, James Hetman's work at the University of Chicago, which shows that these social and emotional skills are more likely to increase academic attainment than focusing on IQ and ability, specific things alone. And they're especially important for kids of deprived backgrounds. And so if you can start building on that sort of academic research and then working, you know, from the ground up and showing some examples of where this has made a difference in schools, then, I mean, yeah, if the government, anything that's going to make a difference and get them re-elected is going to make a difference. But it's, you know, I think start from the ground up, because then you're doing stuff rather than talking about stuff.
I would just say that change is hard, and it takes generations, actually. And, you know, I think we have to have a perspective or a view that extends way beyond our own lifetime. That what we're doing right now is actually, you know, maybe historic. Just even having this conversation is maybe historic. So when you take that perspective, for me, I think that maybe the fruition of all this may be happening like way down the road. So, you know, and then another just quick response, because I know what it feels like to give up, you know, to not want to go on, you know, whether it's my work or personal life or whatever. And that kind of, that's where the rubber meets the road, actually, is when you do get discouraged, when you don't see results, when you get frustrated. And it's in those moments, actually, that we're challenged. And I think that those are actually the teaching moments for us.
I think New Labour and this government have two different approaches to policy. So New Labour thought, okay, there was much more of a centralised top-down thing. They designed this subject, social and emotional aspects of learning, in Whitehall, and then made it part of the curriculum for all schools. But the Tory approach is much more devolved. So it's basically like go away and experiment. Schools can experiment for themselves on what kind of programs they put forward. Like James O'Shaughnessy was the head of policy for Number 10, big believer in things like positive psychology, social and emotional aspects of learning. He decided, that after Gove had, opened the door to these things like academies and free schools, the way to really change was not actually in the centre anymore. So he left, also partly I guess because he fell out with Steve Hilton, but he left government and became a social kind of entrepreneur. He went and joined Wellington and is now setting up a chain of academies which use kind of positive psychology. The idea is that, if it works in one school or in a chain of schools, then it will spread through the system that way, rather than top down. So I would say, go and work with them. I bet James O'Shaughnessy and Anthony Selden would be receptive to that kind of thing, or some of these other chains of academies, because these chains are flourishing. They're spreading through the system very quickly. So I think that would be a really good way to affect change.
I think just there was a quote that popped into my mind, is that we're like planting trees that will shade people in the future, basically. That's basically this whole process of it. It's an emergent kind of way of doing things. As David's saying, it's like a long term. It may not be in our lifetime. It has such a mass scale. I mean, I actually think it will. I think it will happen quite quickly. Well, that's my aspiration. Helen, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, are we possibly doing ourselves a disservice when we talk about compassion, this might be controversial, as being warm, fuzzy, soft? Just thinking back to yesterday, the Donald Trump classic example of, well, you're a loser, if you're interested in these soft, lovely things, you're a loser. Is the way we express our arguments around compassion doing ourselves a disservice, or would it actually be betraying compassion to translate it into harder language? Is it that we need to have a cultural shift towards the warm, fuzzy, soft side of things actually being more valued? And I don't know the answer, I'm just posing that one.
Do you see it as one thing or another, or do you see it's like it could be a multiple thing depending on the audience that's engaging?
Could be use the right argument for the audience, possibly. Yeah.
That's just terrible. A child like that with those kind of wounds, and you poor thing. I couldn't stand them. And then the surgeon came up and he said, "Are you in pain?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay, I'm going to give you something for your pain." And he says, "Your arm is fractured. It feels like your ribs are broken. You have a puncture wound, and we're going to go into a place called an operating theater. We're going to go there. We're going to get you fixed up." That's compassion. And he says, and I remember he helped me through it. And then he leaned down on my face and he says, "You listen to me. You're safe here. You're safe here." And I said, he said, "You look at me. I'm not going to let anybody touch you." That was not warm and fuzzy. That guy was intense, and I thought, adopt me. Adopt me. And then I got in the operating theater, and I hemorrhaged, and unfortunately, they didn't have time for the anesthetic. They started administering it, and they had to go in. That was an interesting experience. And the nurse anesthetist, who was upside down because she was at the head of the table, who called me honey, that always works on me. And she said, "Oh, hold on, honey," and because the surgeon said to restrain him, and when they said that, I went, "Uh-oh, whoa." And she said, "We're going to put you to sleep, lie down. When you wake up, everything will be okay." And I remember her green eyes through the mask, and I thought, I'm 5 You need to wait for me. We'll get married. And looking up in the eyes and everything. And those people were compassionate. They were not warm and fuzzy. And so I have my own personal prejudice as the profoundly compassionate and enlightened being I am. I detest warm and fuzziness. That it misses the point. It bypasses the messy business of being compassionate. If your hands aren't dirty, you're not in it. You're kidding yourself. You're patting your back. You're going to write your check for those kids in Darfur. Bless your heart, but that ain't it. I just have slightly intense feelings about it.
This is just from my background in sort of organisational change and stuff, is that you start from where people are. This helps. And when I go into organisations and talk about this stuff and try and work with organisations around this happiness thing, which compassion is an essential part. I start with the business case and the personal case, because I find that gives permission for people then to engage in this stuff. Once they start to engage in it, it takes over. But you have to start with people out, and if they need some harder facts around this stuff, then get there, because unless we start from where people are, we're not going to get to them. We're not going to help them get the benefits of this stuff. So it's going through that barrier.
Do I need a mic? There's a mic.
Thank you all. It's really been very thought-provoking, and I'm sitting here agreeing with everything you say and in the very next second disagreeing with you, which is kind of confusing. I'm an activist. I work in the field of human rights. I'm a lawyer, and so I engage at the state government level a lot. I campaign and lobby governments at different levels, from ministers through to the working MPs and backbenchers, etc., and other policy and decision makers. And I'm pretty pessimistic about our, certainly in the short term, in my lifetime, possibility of infecting them with sensible compassion. Nonetheless, I do think that we can't give up. Because they actually do have a lot of power to do destructive things, small and large. And so somehow we do have to speak to their interests, speak strategically, convey what we're talking about here in a strategic way that they can understand. And we'll see, as I said, it's in their interests to try and incorporate these principles into their policy making. I mean, policy making, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, is very muddled for the most part. One day it's today's tabloid headline is tomorrow's policy, or it's driven by the short election cycle, and then of course there's the whole ego world of politicians, which is not transformed. So I'm very interested to see how we can actually how we can in fact affect government policy makers at all levels. Because I think, I completely agree with what you said, Ari, about grassroots. And of course, one of in UK and other democratic countries, the voters, of course, are have quite a lot of power. As you said, governments follow, not lead. So how do we? So at the same time, we obviously have to work at the grassroots level, so that we have this pool of people who are voting, saying this is what we expect of our governments. But I think we also need to somehow, and I don't have the answer, work at the government level as well. And I just have to say one thing, I can't help myself. Vanessa, you were saying about, in response to this answer, on diversity and gender policies and efforts to, this is echoing, efforts to address those issues in organisations. And I found myself agreeing completely that we need to emphasise sameness rather than difference, but also completely disagreeing, because that approach has really not served women well and other marginalised groups. And so I think, I see this as a discussion about fundamental human dignity, and that's the sameness thing, but that we're not there at all. I don't think, certainly in my experience of organisations, that people are really ready to understand what that means. And so perhaps we do still need to talk about diversity and gender and these things. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I would say I wasn't saying or, I was saying and.
Okay.
Yeah.
And same with me. I think if we understand that government follows and we can work with them, and what I need to do is remember that they are also the sons and daughters of humanity. And even though I'm turned down, and like the work you do, you've planted the seed. You've begun the process of corrupting this unhealthy way of looking, and you begin introducing it. I mean, it's a classic public health way. And so I spend a lot of time talking with governments and saying, you know, this is coming, and I'm absolutely certain that this will, and it's just a matter of when the right time is for you, given the dynamics that you have to do. They, like all human beings, do not respond well by being attacked. And so I try to understand where they are and so on, and tell them that we're, of course, going to go ahead with stuff, and I'll be working with your police department, but I think as a policy thing, this is going to work. And then in my country, I don't know if it's true here, but data is the drug of choice. It isn't true unless you have somebody outside validating it. So it's, I suppose, when one goes on dates, one should have the research done to see if you truly love this person, and if it validates it, then you're clear to go. I just really quickly, I did a thing at the Snowmass Institute for Educators, and I walked into the room of hospital administrators, and I said, I'm just delighted to be among so many mystics. Everything, room temperature dropped about 15 degrees. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, isn't this advanced leadership for healthcare? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, I was told the room was crammed with mystics. And they, you know, they were dissociating and everything. And they said, no. And I said, well, I have a test. How many you have, and I'll ask you, how many you have someone that you love? Raise your hand, please, if you love, you're sweet on, you care about. Raise only 2 of you. I'm so sorry. But for the 2 of you, how many of you have somebody that you kiss in your life? How many have somebody that you kiss that you don't want to say? So I asked him, I said, how do you kiss? You know, I think it was at Heidegger, Wittgenstein, or somebody said, the scientific view of the world is how the world is, and the mythical view is that the world is. Scientific kissing is closing on target, 15 centimeters away. Let's get that head over just a wee bit, another 4 degrees, please. Lips out, be prepared to sustain the breath for a while. You're going to need to close your eyes. You'll need a mental picture. You decelerate because you don't want to break any teeth. Okay, the pressure up, heart rate up. That is the scientific view way of kissing. The mystical view is you kiss them, and it has its own life. So we have to appreciate that these people in government aren't aware that they're mystics, and I think we should take it upon ourselves to let them know and let them have this thing. And so through the model of being compassionate toward them and understanding, they themselves as human beings will begin to see it. And I think people are talking about, you know, it takes a long time. Yeah, and I think the sort of critical way you look at things at times is the most compassionate thing you can do. Because what will get you to the truth will be the compassionate thing.
Okay, just on time, perhaps just for two more questions. That's fine.
There's something that occupies me a lot. I work in organisations with bringing mindfulness, meditation, compassion into organisations, and I'm also a Buddhist. And for me, the rubber hits the road when people actually work on themselves to integrate these values themselves. So, you know, you would call that practice. And, you know, this American congressman has recently published this book, A Mindful Nation. I mean, he's talking about mindfulness practice, but I haven't read the whole book yet. But as he writes about it, to me, he's talking about mindfulness as a means of developing compassion. And he, for me, he's a hero, because he's kind of had the courage to put his money where his mouth is. Because one thing that worries me, and in a way, this is what I'd like your comments about, what worries me a little bit is I come across, and I'm sure we all do, lots of incredibly highly motivated, well-meaning people who are setting up lots and lots of compassionate systems and methodologies, and people coming with their way of helping us all be compassionate. But it's not based at all in practice, and then they wonder why it doesn't. And interestingly enough, yesterday, we had Patrick Gaffney actually talk through compassion practices, and in talking to people in breaks, I don't hear anyone refer back to that talk. Lots of people refer back to the other talks because there are things that come from them that are much, much easier to talk about. It amuses me, actually, from my point of view, when people think that compassion is warm and fuzzy. Because actually, if you set about the Buddhist compassion training, it's like, it's like before your anesthetic hit. It's blood and guts on the walls, and you have to face the hardest part of yourself. It's no soft ride. So when we characterize compassion as warm and fuzzy, we're so missing the point. And also, we all love His Holiness. We travel